makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
I know you all subscribe to my channel for insightful political analysis on tiny English towns that you've never heard of before, so I will not disappoint you. This video is about a recent by-election, recent as in yesterday, in a place called Batley and Spen in West Yorkshire. If you have never heard of Batley and Spen, and who am I kidding, even I haven't heard of it until recently, and I've lived in Britain for 13 years. There it is, right outside of Leeds. And why is an election in a place like this so important? Well, for two reasons. First of all, Batley and Spen is a constituency of, or was the constituency of, Jo Cox. She was a Labour MP who was murdered in an absolutely savage attack in 2016 by a far-right extremist who, when murdering her, uttered the words, "Britain first," and "keep Britain independent." And this was just months after Brexit. So obviously the attack was tied into the far-right sentiment that Brexit generated. Anyway, running on the part of Labour for this by-election was Jo Cox's sister, Kim Leadbeater. And Labour won, which is a good thing. So I think in terms of preserving the memory and kind of avenging such an awful event like the murder of Jo Cox, which I think is the first time that a British MP had been murdered since the early 90s. I think it was 1990 that someone was murdered by an IRA attack at the time. So the victory was very narrow. So she won by only 323 votes. Very, very close with the Conservatives, who ran second, 34.4. But really the thing to note here is who came in third, which is George Galloway of the Workers' Party, 21.9, which is very, very strong. And this video ultimately is about George Galloway. But before we get into Galloway, I want to mention again why this election is relevant. And the main reason is because there were talks of a possible challenge to Kier Starmer's leadership of Labour if they had lost this election. And to some extent, I think that challenge is still deserved. Labour has seen its share of votes in Batley and Spen fall quite dramatically in the last couple of elections. So just a few years ago, Labour would win an election here with over 50% of the vote. And now they barely scrape by with 35%, which, as you can see from this margin, was very, very narrow. So this is a continuation of just the general trend that we've seen in the last couple of years of Labour performing very poorly in northern districts, especially northern districts that are not in the cities, but sort of in the outskirts of cities, the so-called Red Wall. And not that long ago, back in early May, Labour lost an election in Hartlepool not by a close margin. They were absolutely thrashed by the Tories. And, well, this has led to complaints that Kier Starmer is not fit for the role as leader of the opposition. And quite frankly, I agree. I think Kier Starmer is unelectable, and that is not a phrase that you hear very often in the press used, not just very often, at all, against Kier Starmer. Whereas you saw it almost on a daily basis with Corbyn. And this was despite the fact that Kier Starmer is not doing much better than Corbyn was at his worst. So why all the talk about Jeremy Corbyn being unelectable, and somehow we don't hear the same phrases being used against Kier Starmer? The reason why I think Kier Starmer is unelectable is because he is rather dull and insipid as a politician. And more importantly than that, I mean, dull politicians still win elections all the time, is that he doesn't really have an agenda. there is no transformative Labour agenda, which was the one benefit that Jeremy Corbyn had. I think he was a terrible leader, but he had a very, very appealing agenda, a real left progressive agenda. That Kier Starmer, who is basically a Blairite light, he's not as extreme neoliberal as Tony Blair was, but he's still kind of in that centrist, uninspiring area of the ideological spectrum that, quite frankly, I don't think that centrism has a future in Britain. It doesn't, because most of the problems in Britain have been caused by these same policies, from the Blair era, from the Thatcher era, and that people like Kier Starmer don't really represent a huge shift away from. So the irony of this election is that while I think the result was a good one, was a fair one, that I think Kim Leadbeater definitely deserved to win, and that she will be good for her district, not only because she's Labour, but because she actually lives in her district. So a lot of her opponents in this election were not from there. There weren't residents from there. So someone who clearly knows her constituency will definitely, I think, do a better job than someone who isn't from there. So I'm happy that she won. I'm happy in general that Labour wins. But if this victory gives Kier Starmer a bit of a second wind, if it prolongs his lead, it strengthens his leadership, I think it actually might be bad for Britain, because I don't think Kier Starmer could win an election against Boris Johnson right now. I know this sounds, perhaps shocking for someone who doesn't follow British politics, but the fact is that for all his mistakes, for all his, bumbling incompetence, for all his appeal to a xenophobic populist right in Britain, Boris Johnson is still more popular than Kier Starmer is. And if there was an election tomorrow, he would win. That's a fact. That's not debatable. Perhaps things will change from here to 2024. Perhaps the Tories will be embroiled in scandal, and perhaps the economy is going to tank. Perhaps there will be I don't know. We don't know. But the fact is, as it stands, I don't think Kier Starmer offers a realistic alternative to Boris Johnson, aside from being I'm not Boris Johnson, which I don't think he would win an election just running on that platform. So, having said all that, again, the point here that I'm trying to make is that what is good for Batley and Spen might not be, or what is best for Batley and Spen might not be what's best for Britain in the longer run. So a part of me kind of wanted Labour to lose, just to trigger a possible leadership challenge. Although, again, I have to weigh that in with the fact that I think she was definitely the better candidate, and definitely a place like Batley and Spen deserves a good local politician running it. But back on, before I move into Galloway, I want to show a video of the Tory reaction to their loss. And this is quite funny, because if this reminds you of any recently deposed American tyrant known as Donald Trump, who refuses to accept electoral defeat, who can blame you? So this is amusing.
Thank you for coming on. Why did you lose?
So look, this was always going to be a really tough battle. It was disappointing, but actually we didn't lose. We didn't.
No, I'm sorry, I don't know what you don't understand.
Gain it.
You did lose. I don't know what you don't understand, Amanda. You lost.
So this was a Labour hold.
Yes.
It was not a Labour win. But actually, I just want to.
So it's not a Labour win. What do you class it then?
Well, at the end of the day, this was theirs to lose. This was
and they
theirs
didn't.
To,
they won.
But they only held on by a matter of a few hundred votes, just over 300 votes.
Amanda Milling, do you
honest,
imagine if England beat Ukraine by 1 goal tomorrow night that goes in off the referee's backside on the 89th and a half minute? Do you think England fans will say, we didn't really win, did we? So shall we be candid with each other? There's a problem for the Conservative Party, and just having your leader and Prime Minister arrive, eat an ice cream and walk along the prom and talk about the vaccination programme doesn't cut it any longer, does it, Amanda Milling?
So look, governing parties don't gain by-elections, don't win.
Yeah, okay, whatever you say. Deny the obvious. But yeah, that was pretty funny. Anyway, now back on the subject of this video, George Galloway. If you don't know who George Galloway is, he was made famous, or in some respects notorious, for being one of the most prominent figures of the anti-war movement back in the early 2000s as a reaction to the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. And since then, he's become something of an icon of the British left, or rather a really fringe segment of the British left and international left, I would say, because he is also very well known for cozying to foreign dictators and autocrats and despots and tyrants, and seemingly justifying anything they do just because they are anti-American and thus anti-imperialist. He is essentially a tankie, and I hate tankies. I absolutely detest them. I think they are the absolute scum of the left. I think they aren't really leftist, because leftists stand for democracy. They stand for justice. And we stand for these things not because of who perpetrates them or who is fighting for them and against them. That is irrelevant. So it matters not to me that a genocidal tyrant fights against the US. That does not make him appealing. That still makes him a tyrant. This is not to say that US imperialism or Western imperialism or Israeli imperialism or whoever you want to lump into the typical villains of the anti-war narrative, it's not to say that they're good in any way. I think you can be both. I think you can strongly oppose US and Western imperialism. You can strongly support Palestinians and the absolute oppression that they suffer under Israeli rule. You can stand for all these things. You can support a multipolar world in which China is a global power that competes with the US. You can think that that is a better world than the one that we live in. That does not mean you have to defend the Chinese Communist Party putting its Uyghur population in concentration camps, okay? You can say that it is also good for Russia to be, again, another world power that can challenge American interest abroad. You can say that's a good thing, but you can still say that Putin is an absolute awful human being who is waging other illegal wars himself in eastern Ukraine, or his invasion of Georgia, or his indiscriminate bombing of Syria, which a lot of the people who support charlatans like Galloway seem to think that it's only the West that's bombing Syria, when it's not. So these are the people who see those bombings, who see the Russian bombers drop indiscriminate amounts, because they don't even bother using precision bombs. They just drop the load, and if it's a hospital, if it's a school, who cares? For these people, that's fine. That's not a war crime. Only if the US does it, only if the West does it, only if Israel does it, then it's a war crime. And let's just look at Galloway's record. He was, after the Gulf War, he apparently met with Saddam Hussein. Actually, not apparently, he did meet him. There are photos of him meeting him. Praised him for his courage, strength, and indefatigability. Okay? And became a supporter of the Ba'ath Party. He, that obviously isn't the only global dictator that he has supported. He has heaped praise on the Iranian despot Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. He lauded the leader of Hezbollah and Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. Fidel Castro as well. See, here's where I think people need to understand nuance. Take the Cuban regime, for example. The Cuban regime has done a lot of good things on healthcare, on education. It's also done a lot of bad things in terms of imprisoning political opponents, of not allowing democracy, etc. You can weigh those things in, and you can say that they both matter. You don't have to absolve the side that you don't want, or rather the side that you want, all the bad actions that they've done, just because in general you think they've done more good than bad. I think that's very cowardly. I think that's intellectually dishonest. And I think even worse than being dishonest, I think it's just lazy. Because the world is complicated. It's not black and white. There's no good guys and bad guys. The good guys do bad things too. And bad guys sometimes do good things too. And it's not that hard to just not be so tribalist as to just side with certain groups and then immediately say that everything they do is good. And people like Galloway just are pathologically incapable of that. And the people who support people like Galloway. And there's no shortage of these people. Tankies, essentially. And the internet has no shortage of them. So, his anti-war views are one thing. And the reason that Galloway got into this race is because Batley and Spen has a very large Muslim population. So Galloway banked on the idea that his views on issues like Palestine and Kashmir would be appealing to Muslims in that constituency. And I guess he was right. And this in itself is not a bad thing. I mean, I'm all for politicians running on pro-Palestinian platforms. That's fine with me. But it's not his anti-war message that was so worrying. It was that this was tied with some other really horrible views. Essentially homophobic and transphobic views, which I don't think any leftist should be running on that platform. So let's see one incident in which Kim Leadbeater was harassed by a Galloway supporter. And for the record, Kim Leadbeater is lesbian. So this is important in the context of the homophobic harassment that she suffered in this video.
Sadly, over the last sort of 24 hours, things have become slightly less civil. I was extremely intimidated.
Are you going to stand for those Muslim parents
now?
now?
Do you know what? I'm not going to stand. You shouting at me. The Muslim community of Batley and Spen deserve better than this. They deserve better than this.
We're the community. I'm asking you, are you going to support Muslim parents?
Do not walk away.
You don't want their children to learn about LGBT indoctrination. Are you supporting those kids?
So in case you didn't hear that, he's basically asking her whether she will support Muslim families who don't want their kids to receive any kind of LGBT education, whatever that means. Because this is tied into essentially a far-right narrative of that schools have become woke institutions where you are taught LGBT education and trans ideology, from primary school onward. These are little indoctrination camps. This is a far-right narrative. It is the same narrative that you see right now with this hysteria over critical race theory, despite the fact that critical race theory is not taught in schools at all. In the US, the people who are complaining cannot name a single K-12 school that teaches critical race theory in their curriculum. This is a university level. That's the earliest when you're exposed to it, and in certain degrees, including some that are hardly woke, like law, where it actually originated. Anyway, this character apparently has a record of just basically being a nuisance, and I'm not sure if this was this incident. I guess not, but he was also caught in an event kind of pulling a stunt like this, and with George Galloway in the background kind of laughing. So George Galloway subsequently disowned this, saying that, well, even though this guy was actually campaigning for Galloway, he disowned him. He had nothing to do officially, which is fine. I think politicians should not be made entirely responsible by the actions of their supporters. So in that sense, Galloway is, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. The problem is the words that have come out of Galloway's mouth. And here is a video during the campaign where Galloway essentially goes on a homophobic and transphobic rant, which again, this is straight out of the far-right playbook. And let's hear it. The first part of this video is a bit difficult to hear, so I'm going to just repeat it until it becomes a bit more legible.
About what's taught in the school. Some of you won't like this. I'm the father of 5 school-age children. And I don't want my young children at primary school, aged 7 and 9, taught about sex.
So he says he has primary school age children, and he doesn't want them to be taught sex in primary school.
I don't want them taught how to masturbate.
He doesn't want them to be taught how to masturbate, as if this was part of a primary school curriculum anywhere.
I don't want them taught about anal sex.
Doesn't want them to be taught anal sex. Again, I would love to see a curriculum of a British school or any school where the kids in primary school are taught anal sex. Again, this is straight out of the far-right playbook.
I don't want them taught that there's 99 genders.
He doesn't want them to be taught about 99 genders.
I don't want them taught that men can become women by the
Doesn't want them to be taught that men can become women.
mere act of declaring themselves to be and end up in an Olympic team beating the actual girls and the actual women.
Doesn't want them competing in the Olympics and beating real women.
I don't want them taught that parents chest feed when in fact it's women who breastfeed. Glory to women. Women hold up half the sky. This kind of woke, liberal identity politics is anathema to me.
So, there you go, from his own mouth. Now, it would be bad enough if he held these views in private, but ultimately we can't control what people think in private. But the fact that he's saying this proudly, in public, recording it, and then his party proudly tweeting it, really tells you the degree of scumbaggery that George Galloway represents. This is not a leftist. I don't care. Maybe he once was a leftist. Maybe one day he did care about class struggle and things like that. But nowadays, that's not what he represents. Nowadays, what he represents is hate and division. Because if you're running on a platform in which you are essentially trying to whip up hatred by Batley and Spen's Muslim community instead of unity, in a country where racism is a real big problem, if you're basically running on a platform of homophobia and transphobia and proudly showing it to the world this way, you're not a leftist. I don't care how much you claim that you support Palestine or how much you supposedly fight against American forever wars and Britain's complicity in them. None of this really makes you care about human beings. And that's what's so awful about people like George Galloway, because they could use their undeniable appeal in many respects for good. Because we do need politicians who stand up against war, against imperialism, against hyper-capitalism. We do need them. We don't want, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I'm bringing this up in the context of Kier Starmer essentially not being what Britain really needs. But then this is not the alternative in any conceivable way. I just can't imagine what would be of a world run by people like George Galloway. It would essentially be very authoritarian. It would not be socially progressive in any way. And at this point, he doesn't have any values to support. Like a person like George Galloway is merely defined by what he opposes, not by what he supports. And that is the biggest warning sign, I would say, of any politician or any public figure at all in general. So real leftists should try and construct a nation or a world based on principles, based on things that they support, not base themselves on what they're against. Because all this does, when all this anti-war obsession just gets to your head and you can't think, your worldview is completely clouded by this, and you cannot think of anything else, then you end up being like George Galloway. You end up supporting some of the most horrible tyrants in the world, justifying all the horrible things they do just because they're anti-American tyrants. Then it's fine. And it makes you sympathize with discourse and rhetoric like this, hateful rhetoric like this, because this is pure homophobia and this is pure transphobia, and we should not live in a world where this discourse is normalized. So I'm sorry, if you're a leftist who thinks George Galloway has any sort of importance on the left, then I think you're lost. I think you're utterly, utterly lost. And, I hope you see the light at some point. And to end this video, I'll quote something that a friend of mine wrote. A friend who's actually more lefty than I am. So just as a frame of reference. He writes, I met Galloway in 2003 when I was young and part of the anti-war protest. I asked him in a lecture hall, perfectly genuinely, what the argument should be against those who say we have to do something about Saddam's human rights abuse. I didn't think we should do nothing, but I didn't know what. He attacked me for asking the question, presumably interpreting me to mean that I was in favor of invading Iraq. Angry man, stupid man. That's exactly what he is. So, on that note, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you're a tanky, you probably are going to downvote it. So, bring it. I'm going to make more anti-tanky videos, trust me. This won't be the last. Because I really, really want people to think critically and have nuance. And not just to see the world in these binary, you're with me or you're against me terms. Because that was the language of George Bush, ironically, at the time. And what these people like Galloway do is simply flip it around. So, if you like it, please share. Most importantly, please subscribe. And I'll see you next time.